said again today that NATO is stronger than it's ever been, and when I read the document, I feel there's like this collective, there's kind of a dissonance between what we see in the world and what we have to say about NATO. We've got an ally that had its designs on Greenland. A bunch of other allies had to go there with a trigger force, right, to keep this ally away. We've had that ally calling others cowards. We have the Secretary of State and Defense who don't turn up. Russia remains the biggest threat to NATO, and doesn't seem like President Putin is intimidated at all, really. And you've said yourself, within the next few years, he could launch an attack somewhere in Europe. How is it that NATO is so strong in these circumstances?
Well, let me answer that question head on. And I've said it before. I don't believe that with the present American administration, the whole of NATO would have been reaching the 2% at the end of 2025. Take some big economies like Spain and Italy and Belgium and Canada. We're far from the 2% mark. They all got to the 2%. And this is bringing in billions and billions of euros/dollars to spend on defense. And then the Hague Summit, without the present administration in the United States and the present president, I don't think we would ever have reached this commitment to spend 5% of our GDP on defense, including the 3.5% on core defense. And then finally, I think it was very important that the new American president coming in, Trump 47, opened the dialogue again with Russia to end the war in Ukraine. Because in the end, it was only the United States, I believe, who was able to break that deadlock. The alliance, NATO, has for some time been clear, even before I became Secretary General, that Iran cannot possess a nuclear weapon. And NATO has also long recognized the threat Iran's missile program posed to allies and their interests. And what the United States is currently doing is degrading those capabilities, both the nuclear and the missile. And take as an example what happened with Diego Garcia, the UK-US base, which was targeted by a missile which therefore could reach 4,000 kilometers. So the logical conclusion of that missile launch is that Iran has now capabilities increasingly dangerous for allies.
You told our partners at CBS News that President Trump is doing this to make the whole world safe. I was just wondering how you can argue that in the short and medium term, and also how concerned you are about the impact on Ukraine, because you talk about how it's so central to Europe's security, and we've seen already how it's really benefiting President Putin, what's happening in terms of the easing of sanctions on oil, and that the Ukrainian conflict is being overshadowed, which I know is a concern of yours. And secondly, if I may, you have made a conscious decision not to criticize President Trump publicly. You're among a number of figures on the global stage who have done that. But just last week, he was saying that NATO allies were cowards for not joining what's happening in Iran, joining him and Prime Minister Netanyahu. And in that Truth Social post, he ended it by saying, we will remember. Now, whether or not President Trump is aware of this, but that has real echoes and chimes with words of remembrance that for more than 100 years, people in Europe in particular have been using that sort of phrase, we will remember them. So I just wonder, I'm not inviting you to criticize President Trump, because I know that's something you've been reluctant to do, but how does that touch you? How does that feel you when you see that sort of post?
Well, thank you. Let me, various elements in the question. So first on Ukraine, the good news is that essential equipment into Ukraine continues to flow. And that is important because we have to do everything, and NATO is very much involved through the Command in Wiesbaden, through JTAC, individual nations providing support to Ukraine, including the essential equipment coming from the United States, paid for by European allies, getting into Ukraine. So that continues, that's good. Then when it comes to the comments of President Trump, as I said also on CBS, what I've been seeing is some frustration with him about the Europeans needing to take time to react to his request when it comes to this question of making sure that sea lanes are open. And I said, hey, there is a reason for that. And the reason is that for good reasons, the US was not able to consult with allies because they wanted to keep the campaign secret. And again, for good reasons, to make sure that nobody knew what happened on that Saturday morning. There's always a risk if you inform too many people that things might leak. But that also had the disadvantage that it takes time for the Europeans to get organized. The good news now is that thanks to the leadership from the United Kingdom, France and others, originally 6 countries, the UK, France, Italy and Germany and Japan and the Netherlands, then on Friday 22 countries and by now over 30 countries have committed to come together to discuss the what, the where and the when it comes to making sure that the sea lanes stay open. And this is exactly also to the request of President Trump. And more generally, when it comes to the Middle East and the situation with Iran, NATO has been consistent over the years that NATO does not want, as an alliance, and this is a collective position, for Iran to get its hand on either a nuclear capability or a missile capability. Of course, we know that Russia, Iran, North Korea and China are working closely together. We know that Iran is one of the suppliers of essential gear for Russia to maintain and solidify its war against its unsolicited provocation, war against Ukraine. That's clear. So it tells you something when these reports come out that Russia is sharing so much also with Iran. So let's not be naive about that. I cannot tell you what intelligence is telling us because obviously that's intelligence, so that we keep that secret. But you can see yourself from open sources, and we noticed for some years that there is a close connection between Iran, Russia, North Korea, and China. And then on the second question, all 32 allies, they all agree that Russia is our most significant threat. There is no discussion about that. A threat to our security now and longer term, and also that all 32 allies are totally committed to make sure that we have the collective defense in place, we take the necessary steps required to ensure indeed that we can deter any defense. So we're working together with all allies on this every day. Actively now, countries are working together, and the United Kingdom is leading that effort under Prime Minister Starmer and the senior military in the United Kingdom, together with France and others, to make sure that those questions will be answered. And this is to President Trump's request. He said, hey, I would have rather have that seen earlier starting. And there my reaction is, Europe needed time because the United States, for good reasons, was not able to inform allies of what was going to happen now 3.5 weeks ago on Saturday morning, because that would have that would have potentially led to a leak or whatever. That was always a risk when the US had the opportunity to take out Iran's leadership. So I totally understand that. I don't criticize that, but it means that it takes some time for Europe to come together, and that's happening as we speak.
So in that same Washington Post story, it said that the Pentagon had actually notified Congress that it intended to divert about $750 million in funding provided by NATO countries through Pearl to restock the U.S. military's own inventories rather than to send additional assistance to Ukraine. What is your reaction to this, and was NATO notified of this change? Thank you.
Well, again, it's not for me, and it's not very difficult to do this in an open presser, but to comment on individual weapon deliveries. But I can assure you that the critical support from the United States into Ukraine, paid for by allies, so this famous abbreviation Pearl, continues to flow.
Secretary General, so based on the report and what you have already mentioned about Ukraine, NATO is now coordinating the arms deliveries to Ukraine. It's coordinating the training for Ukrainian army. It is learning its lessons, as you said, from Ukrainian war experience through, well, NATO is for coordinating and JTEC is for the lessons learned. We have heard news about the role of Ukrainians also in different military trainings and maneuvers. And given this level of operational involvement and cooperation, would you describe Ukraine as already part of NATO's defense ecosystem, even without the formal membership?
Well, let's be very precise on this. NATO is not party to the conflict. So NATO is indeed coordinating all the support, the training and the weapons deliveries and capturing all the lessons and making sure we share them within NATO. And then, of course, we also share our insights with Ukraine through this joint education and training center in Poland, the so-called JTEC. You're totally right on that. But then I don't want to put a particular frame on it. There is a path into NATO for Ukraine, which was agreed at the Washington Summit in 2024. That path will take time because we know there are various allies not accepting NATO membership at the moment. So that is not on the cards for now. But we also know that through the coalition of the willing, together with the United States, in Paris in January, under the leadership of President Macron, we agreed on what the security guarantees for Ukraine should look like post a ceasefire or a peace deal. Preferably a peace deal, if not, then at least a long-term ceasefire. And I think that is extremely relevant, because in the end, if it is not NATO membership, and again, that's not on for now, we have to make sure that when the war stops, Putin will not try again, because he knows, and this is why we need the security guarantees, that the reaction will be devastating, and that is collective. NATO, countries outside NATO, this coalition of the willing, many NATO countries, including the United States, involved.
President Trump is calling your organization an organization of cowards. You're not responding to that. Is that your strategy to keep the Americans on board?
Well, let me be clear. As Secretary General, of course, the alliance is very dear to me, otherwise I would not have this role. But as I said before, the United States, under this president, is doing stuff which is quite crucial for the alliance. But then I have to repeat a little bit. It is starting again the dialogue with Russia, breaking that deadlock, getting the peace process going. It is making sure that the whole of the alliance came up to the 2%. I'm again not sure whether we would have reached that at the end of last year without President Trump. And then in The Hague, we agreed on the 5% spending target. And this is doing two things. One, it is equalizing with the US. That is taking out this big irritant that the Europeans and the Canadians are spending less than the Americans. A problem basically since Eisenhower. So, hey, it was about time to solve that issue. But more importantly, it is making sure that as an alliance as a whole, we have what it takes and what we need to deliver on the capability targets defense ministers agreed last June in 2025, so that if the Russians or whoever adversary wants to try something against us, we are not only now, yes, now we can defend ourselves, but also longer term we can do that. That's why we need to spend that 3.5% core defense spending, 5% overall. And that is all, yeah, I think also in a large part, and not every European likes me to repeat this, but it is true. Without Trump, I don't think it would have happened.
You talk about overwhelming support from NATO and that United States are crucial for a peace negotiation. Yesterday from Ukraine, we heard that United States pressure Kyiv to give up Donbas region in exchange for security guarantees from American side. Would you say it would be a fair deal, fair offer, or fair ask from a country who defended itself for more than 4 years to give up territory in exchange of security guarantees? Thank you.
Well, let us first of all agree that all of us want this war to end. That is the United States, European part of NATO, Canada, but also Ukraine. Also, Ukraine wants this war to end, but it has to be a lasting end. And it means that after war ends, we have to make sure that Ukraine is sovereign, that Ukraine is secure, and we have seen a speeding up of the peace process thanks to President Trump, and I mentioned it already, commanding the US efforts there. But for Ukraine to be not only sovereign, but also secure, key in all of this are the security guarantees. They are absolutely vital. And this is why it was so important that in Paris in January, the United States and the coalition of the willing agreed on the security guarantees. Because this prevents Vladimirovich Putin from ever attacking Ukraine again post a long-term ceasefire or preferable a full peace deal. And of course, when it comes to territory, any decisions on territory clearly are for Ukraine to take.
What is NATO's concern now on the security in the Eastern Mediterranean? Thank you.
Well, on your first question, let's be lucid and conscious of the fact that Diego Garcia is 4,000 kilometers away from Iran. So if a missile from Iran is able to reach Diego Garcia, that is a relevant development. And what I was saying before to one of the questions asked, that it means that Iran already had capabilities which are dangerous for allies, but this means they are increasingly dangerous for allies. And you can do the math yourself, 4,000 kilometers. So in that sense, it's clear that where NATO allies collectively, unanimously agreed that two things should not happen. One is Iran having a nuclear capability. And secondly, Iran having its hands on a missile capability of this magnitude. Then clearly there is reason to assume that there is an increasingly more dangerous situation for allies. The good news, of course, is that allies are prepared. We can defend ourselves. NATO is a very strong alliance. And you have seen that in Turkey with the 3 missiles heading for Turkey. And let me say to all citizens in NATO territory that our military, under the leadership of the Supreme Allied Commander, they are on this, all of them, to make sure that we have what it takes and what we need to defend every inch of Allied territory.
Then like, share and subscribe to Mirror Now.